This is Charlie. This is the podcast To Hell is Back. And it's May 20th. I know that because it's 1 week after my birthday. So for the next few weeks, I'll always be, that's how I'll remember the dates. And I'm in Northampton, Massachusetts. And I have a guest today joining me, a friend. Is Kathryn Patrick, who is here for, I'll let her introduce herself in a minute, where she's from. I just want to say that there's also on today and on, I think usually, is Abby Ingbar, who is the executive director of NEA-BPD, which is like our co-organization. Well, no, I guess I'm not an organization, but she's our co-host or co-sponsor. I don't know what she is, but she's head of NEA-BPD, and this has always been associated with NEA-BPD and attainable on its website, among other places. So welcome to Abby and everybody else from NEA-BPD. Yeah, so that's it. So let me get us started. And, you know, by getting us started, I want to first, the topic for today, it's hard to say where it's grown out of, but in a way it doesn't matter, because all of us, it grew out of different situations that affect every one of us, which is the life in the pandemic. And it affects every one of us profoundly, but it affects every one of us differently. And some things the same, but it affects every one of us. It's one of those rare moments, I think, in our lives that something affects all of us. Some change in one strand of RNA in China when a bat transmitted it to a human, presumably, after it changed inside a bat. And if you understand what viruses are, it's just that boundary between life and inanimate life, because it isn't really a living thing by definition. But on the other hand, it gets into living things and it generates itself, as we all know. But that little biological event in one cell in China, look what's happened. Like that change, which then can affect another cell in the same person probably, and a third cell in that same person, and in particular respiratory cells in the epithelium of respiratory parts of our bodies. I mean, it's like unbelievable that this one little thing, but it's like an example of interdependency, that one little change in one little cell, in one little strand, in one little nucleus in China, by now has changed our lives. Because of that, we're having this right now. Because of that, I have a longer beard than I've had since I was probably 25. And because of that, I know my dogs better than I've ever known them. And because of that, I know my wife better than I've ever known her. And I've had more to do with my children, who are adult children who can't live in our house, but more and then everything. And it's true for every one of you. But you can name about 400 things that actually are different because of this one little strand of RNA. I mean, I don't want to just keep going over that. It sort of would sound deadening and boring if I were you. But to me, I can't get over it. What an incredible thing it is. And yet when I think about it, how actually it's not that incredible. It's normal. It's what happens because of one thing. It's that butterfly effect. That everything around the world changes eventually because of one butterfly flapping its wings somewhere, but this is sort of more obvious. So that's why we're here in this particular conversation, which I call Lessons from the Pandemic, which basically is a topic that allows Kathryn and me to talk about whatever we want about the pandemic and how it has led us to have certain thoughts. And this gives us a chance just to share those thoughts. And we're certainly not alone if you go around the internet, where people are producing content all over the place about how to cope with the pandemic. And there's wonderful stuff out there. And some of it's very specific and some of it's general. Some of it's based on DBT and DBT skills. I've listened to podcasts myself that are about that, that are really good. This is a little different in that we're not here to teach any particular skills. We're not here to say, okay, use this, 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 and this in order to cope with this. On the other hand, we'll probably dip in and out of that just by our own reflections of what of how we are coming to grips with this ourselves. So I hope it's useful to some people listening. So having started there, just to lay the groundwork a little bit about what we're doing, I want to introduce Kathryn and ask her to introduce herself a little bit. I mean, here, let me say it in a sort of, in the way I feel it, but it isn't exactly like a normal introduction, Kathryn. Kathryn, I feel like is, even though we've known each other for a good while now and we've worked together, I feel like she's like a new friend. That's also in some ways a result of the pandemic. I don't know. It isn't just that, but we've been talking and sharing observations. And so I'm just really happy that we can do this. She's also going to teach an intensive DBT training with me starting in July. That was to be based in Brooklyn, but now it's virtual online training. And if any of you are interested in that who are DBT therapists or in teams, you know, you can check it out at my website. Just go to the events on charlieswenson.com, and it begins in like the third week of July for 5 consecutive weeks. There'll be 1 day each week, because let me tell you, if you have tried to do 5 days in a row of 7 or 8 hours looking at your goddamn little screen constantly, you have no idea what it will do to your brain. You will never be the same again. It's just so deadening. So we're trying to make it less deadening and more absorbable. And actually, we're trying to take advantage of what's an advantage of spreading this over several weeks. So that's going to be fun for us. So Kathryn, would you say a little about yourself, and then we'll lead into wherever we're going to end up talking about this.
Yeah. Well, hi, all. It's nice to be joining you here, Charlie, and all of the listeners. Both those are here now and will listen later. I guess a little about me. I'm here in Denver, Colorado. This is my home where I grew up. And I work here. I run a private practice. I do DBT in my private practice here in Denver, and a various number of different other hats that I wear. I'm a trainer and a teacher. I teach at the University of Denver here in their graduate school of social work as well. And then I've got 2 young kiddos that I'm raising with my husband, Adam, who's also on listening here today. And so I've got, now he's 8, an 8 and a 6-year-old at home who are doing homeschool with my sister, who's also joining here today, who is now living with us. As a result of the pandemic, our family has grown and our household is bustling and all of that. So that's a little about me.
What has, obviously you've already said these huge things that have changed for you. By the way, just even knowing you adds to my gratitude that I don't have young children at home during this period of time. So thank you for that. I mean, it's like I realized, no, I have a 21-year-old and a 25-year-old boy, and they come buzzing around sometimes, but they're living separately from us, and they socially distance from us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not the same as having 2 little kids. I mean, I used to do webinars at home in situations like this, and my kids were like the age of your kids, and I'd be trying to teach, and they'd be crawling under my chair. I mean, they'd be going back and forth and trying to see if it disrupts my teaching. So,
oh my gosh. I have absolutely had that experience many times. Well, I'm sure I've had meetings with you interrupted by my kiddos before, and online, I've had that happen many times. My kids busting in the background of my screen, but fortunately tonight they are, I believe, watching Dino Dana with their auntie. So that's much more interesting than Mama.
Mama on a podcast, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, after years of doing these podcasts, my 21-year-old asked me about last week, like I've done them for 3 years or so, and my 21-year-old who has lived at our house most of that time in the basement in his own cave said, "Hey Dad, do you do podcasts?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Wow." what are they about? And I told him, and then he has a girlfriend who is going to do counseling with people with addictions, and said, could we listen to your podcast? I said, yeah. So it was kind of cool. You generate stuff for 3 years. So,
Yeah.
Who knows? You might even affect your children, but not,
Yeah.
it's not at 6 and 8. You're a poor competitor,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not nearly as interesting as,
They get enough of you.
yeah.
Let me just say a couple things and then invite you to just join in also. I'll tell you, my experience of this pandemic, at first, when I think it's so different than everything else, before I think about the fact in other ways it's the same as everything that happens, in that, like I introduced things, this one thing happened with a virus. The virus spread to other cells in one person. Those cells burst with viral particles, which went to other cells, which burst with virus particles, which went to other cells, which really was devastating for this individual. And then it got to another individual, so-called human-to-human transmission. And then it went to another individual, and then it's sort of like there. I mean, if you think of it that way, because really what you want to think about when coping with this pandemic is never to forget. Really, you want to think about this from the point of view of as if you are a cell coping with virus particles. I mean, that's where your brain should be, to be thinking of how to respond to be safe. And that's been said 1,000 times in the public, but there's some people who don't think that way or don't get it that way. It's a very basic biological process, and there are basic things to do to protect yourself. Basically, that you don't let the virus get into your respiratory cells. It's in a way as complicated and as simple as that. And as a result of that, as a necessity, we end up with, I think, categories of people around the world. Category number 1, people who get infected. And they, as a result of this virus, are having one whole set of experiences. Category number 2, people who are close to those people. They're having a whole set of experiences. Category number 3, those who are trying to take care of those people. Those people who are on the front lines, basically, who are staring down this virus in the situation of people in hospitals, nursing homes, prisons. In our case, there's also residential treatment programs that I consult to, community group homes that I consult to. It's like, so it's all those people who are trying to take care of the people who have that and take care of the people who are close to the people who have that. Those are like 3 categories of the people who are all sort of on the front lines of this battle. And then there's everybody else in different postures, one step or more removed from the front lines, but constantly affected and changed, and whose way of being is different than all of these other people. And I'm one of those up to now. I've consulted with, I've treated, I've dealt with people who are on the front lines, people who are next to people on the front lines. But so far, I've not been sick. So far, no one in my family has been sick. So far, nobody I know personally has died, but I've known people who know people who have died and whose lives are now inalterably changed. But, so I feel I'm in that last category, and that's probably the majority category. And it's a complicated category to be in, I find, because, I feel like I should be on the front lines. And I'm 71 years old as of last week. And I'm in some ways, in some places around here, not even allowed to be on the front lines if I even tried to rush in and take care of people. So it's complicated because then there's the feeling of guilt, and I should be there. And so that's complicated. And then also learning to live with such different rhythms. So the first thing I would highlight about the impact of this pandemic is that the degree to which there is extraordinary level of interdependency in the world, that the boundaries between us, which we conventionally respect, are just that. They are constructs, they're ideas that there's this boundary between me and you. But then what about the virus? The virus doesn't respect that boundary. And in fact, When there's a change in you, there's a change in me. When there's a change in somebody in Wuhan, China, there's a change in me. And therefore, this idea that I am a separate being, that I am a being that with an independent, essential self at my core, which you could find if you knew how to do anatomy and knew how to get inside there and say, there's Charlie Swenson. There it is. There's the essence. There's the unique being. There's the self. You'd find it, you know what? It's made up entirely of non-Charlie Swenson. It's made up of everybody else. It's made up of you guys, actually, by this point, even right now, even in these few minutes. So it's like it really reminds you that we're extraordinarily interdependent, that boundaries are in some ways helpful, but they're kind of a conventional construct. But actually, if you just drop that notion and realize we're all just, we're in the same ocean and we're jostling around and things are traveling among us that are affecting us every minute, and that we in some ways cannot fairly claim anything as our own, even our last thought. Even these gestures probably came from my grandparents or great-grandparents or my father or other people that, I don't even know. So, I can't really, so it's kind of like, how do you live once you let go of this conventional concept? And I think there are ways to live. You realize, okay, that's the case. And therefore I'm in a jostling sea of activity and changes, and every change affects every other change, and every other change affects me, and I affect everybody else. So it's transactional, it's constantly transactional. So these are concepts, but for me, they're not the specific skills of DBT, but they're things I'm aware of, that thinking that way, that there is entire interdependency, that there's transactionality between people, that there's constant flow between people, that there's no essential self that isn't interactional with other people. And therefore, can I just acknowledge that? Or does that make me psychotic to acknowledge that? Because it is kind of like, it can kind of make you a little bit crazy when you start giving up the idea you have a boundary and a separate self. And so I find, though, that that's the beginning of where I go when it comes to the pandemic. And I realized I'm getting to know my dogs better because of a virus that emerged in China. Like, is that crazy or not? I mean, and not only that, I'm more with my wife in the house, and which exposes me to the fact, as I was telling Kathryn earlier today, that I said to my wife last night, imagine, honey, if you were a person, a man, who likes to talk with somebody way more than that other person likes to talk back. Like, imagine if you're somebody who likes to have dialogue about lots of things, and the other one actually just doesn't have that same kind of need in their brain. That one needs more silence. Imagine that poor dude, that he is so starved for conversation. And she said, yeah, it's a good point. Imagine a woman that is shacked up with a guy because of the coronavirus who talks all the time, and who actually likes a lot of silence. Like, wow, tough thing. Yeah, right. All of this because of the virus, and it sort of gets you to know things that you didn't know about your relationship as clearly. So anyway, just lots is happening because of this virus. And I think that it is, from my point of view, is skillful to look under the surface of our usual conventional things and look beyond the specifics of some of the DBT skills and just recognize reality in its kind of tumultuous, interdependent nature. And to me, that, strangely enough, somehow helps me just kind of go with the waves rather than try to go as if the waves aren't around me, as if I could be independent of all of that. So I'll just be quiet, Kathryn. I wonder kind of where you go with any of that or not, or something else related to what you're going through.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking of, I had kind of a little image developing in my mind of exactly that, like sort of the waves, the way that everything is sort of shifting. And I think there's, at least for me, I think this experience has brought to the surface like the reality of interdependence that I think I've always understood, or not always understood, but certainly in my training have come to understand on a very intellectual level. But at this point, given the dramatic change in lifestyle, it's hard to not be more keenly aware, even in my own body, more keenly aware of how connected I am to so many other people and things that I never even had really awareness of before. And it's funny because I was thinking about earlier today, I was thinking like, what exactly was kind of the first moment of all of this, you know, me personally experiencing the pandemic. And I think about a week before, maybe a few days before my kids' school closed, because my kids' school closed really early because a parent of one of the kids had been diagnosed with coronavirus. And my sister was at that time, you know, still living in her place and anticipating going back to work. And she had come over to visit, and I walked in and I said, like, so are you worried, or how are you doing with all of this news? And she was kind of like, well, what do you mean? And it happened like that. Like, you know, one minute she's anticipating going back to work. She works in the travel industry. So she was anticipating heading off to Japan in a few weeks. And everything sort of seemed to be going in a certain direction. And then we have this one conversation, and within 24 hours, it became clear like she probably wasn't going to be going back to work anytime soon. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just that, I mean, everything then changed, right? So it's like, she's not going back to work. And then the next day, or maybe it was 2 days later, my son's school closed, and then my other son's school closed. And within a week, our entire life was a completely different routine and a completely different, you know, with different rhythms and everything. And I was thinking about like just the shifting nature of things, and how actually like I had all these thoughts in my mind about like, well, when is it going to go back? Or here's what we're going to do to kind of get through all of this. And all of it is sort of like either past or future, and not just right now, but really like the only thing that is anything other than, you know, shifting sands and moving waves is right now.
Yeah.
It's hard to stay with just right now. But I think that's become keenly, or I've become more acutely aware of that that's kind of all there is.
What is hard to, when you say it's hard to stay with what is now, you make a good argument for the wisdom of staying with what's now, even though it's also useful to try to stick to something you were going to do. But what is hard about staying with what's now? I genuinely mean that. This is not a setup question.
Yeah.
I wondered
Well,
what you mean.
I think that what is hard about it is, I feel, at least for me, it is because it's like always new. You know, it's like what like now is not now of the minute that I said it a minute ago. And it's not the same now that it's going to be in a minute from now. Now is always moving and always changing. And so it's sort of like, I mean, I sort of think of it as like, you know, like, do you remember the song from Sound of Music? How do you catch a problem like Maria? How do you catch a cloud and pin it down? Like, it's sort of a thing that's always moving, and a thing that's not really tangible enough to sink into, you know, just right now. And yet that's what it is. That's the thing. It's the moment. And the moment is going to come, and then it's going to go again. So I just think like keeping our minds with just, you know, I was writing actually right before this a little bit about this, you know, all of the ideas of impermanence that have been like just flowing through my mind so much. And what I think the best way to describe it is, I feel like my mind wants to go to what was, as if I have some right to that because I had it or because I experienced it, that I have some right to the past. And yet the past, you know, is gone. It's no longer here. And then my mind wants to find something to say, well, this is what will be, or, you know, it will be so for the future, or try to create something to hold on to. And that's not now either. I mean, it's sort of ideas about it, and I might be able to influence the creation of those things, and yet it's not what is right now.
Right.
And sometimes I think it's just these pulls of the mind to the past and the future that make it difficult to see and to stay with what is actually here and now.
Mm, mm. You know, the way when you talk, I have noticed this about you before, but your talk lends itself to musical numbers. You know, like what you just said about Sound of Music. I just heard several songs almost in what you were saying. You know, that one is perfect for this, what we're talking about how do you hold a moonbeam in your hands? The idea that these things come like that, and then you can't hold on to them. You can't hold on to them. And it's so much more true than most other things. And so I think all of us who have said from the beginning of this, I can't wait till we go back to normal. It's like it's an idea going back to normal. I mean, there's not going to be a same normal, whatever it's going to be. Even if it looks the same, it's not going to be the same normal, and it's probably not going to look the same. And it's really like hard, and that's a painful thing. Creates anxiety, and especially, let's say, people who have lost their work. I mean, my sister, who lives in Seattle and who worked at a dentist's office, and who lived next door almost to the very first institution in this country where there were lots of deaths from COVID in Kirkland, Washington, across from Seattle. I mean, she couldn't work in a dentist's office where she worked as an office manager. So that was done. That was the paycheck. That was the month, that was the week to week life, you know. So, and then she called us at the very beginning, when I realized, oh, this might affect my life. This isn't just something happened in a little place in Seattle. Therefore affects my sister, which affects me. But no, this is because she texted me when I was at a movie one Saturday night in early March. And it was just a text that said, there is no hand sanitizer in all of the state of Washington. And do you have any there in Massachusetts? If so, can you send me some? And we were in a mall where there's a movie theater. So at the movie ended right after that, we went walking around the mall and found a little place that was like a body shop or lotion and body or something that I'd never seen before. And they had one little tray that still had a few hand sanitizers left. And I felt like a hoarder. I took 20 of them out of about 30, and they used to have hundreds, and they were all gone except these last ones. And we got them, you know, and next day it was FedEx. And we saved a couple for ourselves. We're still using those two little sprays, but it's like, oh my God, that's when it penetrated for me that this is a big deal. and still it felt like, oh well, that's on the West Coast, you know, that's Seattle, it's not going to hit here. And then it was like New York, oh, that's a little closer. Northern Italy, when I had a lot of friends there, it's like, that's pretty far away. But you know, and then you don't get until you start thinking how thoroughly this is going to penetrate the earth, and for obvious reasons. But nobody can stop it except through the elimination of transmission. That is it. That is all we're stuck with. That's why everybody keeps saying the same things on television. You know, isolation, contact tracing, testing, those three things over and over, because it's like those are the things that allow you to, and social distancing, that's it. You know, there's not any other major strategies. So really, it affected us all so fast. I very much identify with that idea that part of what makes it difficult to cope with a pandemic is the fact that that where the mind goes in order to seek security is the past, and projecting the past into the future, all of which leaves aside the present moment. In the idea, okay, well, it was that way. I'm seeing my patients, and I'm going to keep seeing my patients. No, I'm not. Oh, well, there's these two patients I am going to keep seeing in person because they're going to be so lonely in their lives that they have to see me. Guess what? No, I'm not. It was unbelievable to me that these last two people I was seeing out of all my practice they were going to not see me, which is the one human being they actually interact with in their lives. And it's like, oh my God. And so now what do we have? we have a very rich Zoom relationship, as crazy as Zoom is and as flattening and two-dimensional as Zoom is. It's like twice a week with one of them. You know, I go on and he goes on, and there he is in the same chair, sitting down like this. And there I am in the same place right here, sitting back. And I say, here we are again. And he smiles, and we have a whole thing that goes on. And we've tried to figure out how to make the best of it. And so, you know, once you accept that you now have been caught by a different wave on your surfboard or whatever it is, or your body surfing, and you've been caught by a different wave, that it's not going to work to pretend it's the previous wave. It's not going to work to pretend that you can hold the position you were holding with the previous wave, that you're actually going to have to go with that wave. Whatever that means, you're going to have to like, okay, it's going to be Zoom for now. Maybe tomorrow it'll be something else. But I'm going to like zoom ahead in my relationships now, much as I find it, you know, like on Monday and Tuesday of this next week, and on Thursday and Friday, I'm doing full day workshops in Sweden that we're going to be in person. And so they start at 5 in the morning so that they are, because of the time difference. And I'm going to be on the screen like this all day long, you know, looking at people and looking at PowerPoint slides and showing videos. It's like, oh my God, it's going to be so hard. But, you know, it's what we got. And what I find, Kathryn, amazing is how, and even how you described within a few days, you went from one life plan to a different life plan. Your sister's coming in, your sister can't go to work, your kids can't go to school, you still have a practice, you've still got this whole thing going, and it's like, oh my God. And it's kind of remarkable about us that we actually do shift, but it's not without some angst, right?
You know, can I jump in, Charlie? I was just thinking, you know, in that comment about like everything moving to Zoom and the, you know, I feel like the other thing that this all highlights is just sort of the duality or the two-sided nature of things. Because even with that, you know, I was thinking about right before we started here today, you were looking at my behind me, or I don't know if it was maybe talking earlier, but I have this loom in my, I work now out of my craft room in the basement of my house. And I've got this loom and all my like sewing stuff down here. And there is a way that I think that as it's been this adjustment where it feels it is sort of this now two-dimensional flat screen. I'm looking at my computer all day. And then there's the other side where I'm seeing into people's lives in ways that I never did before, people whose homes I've never seen, or, you know, and I learn little things about them too. And I think when you say like the way that somehow we do adjust and somehow we do adapt to the change as, you know, as a species, you know, we figure it out. And I do think there's these subtle ways where we find something to kind of hold on to in some way that it, you know, like the making lemonade out of lemons. There's a way in which I think as separated as we are, we can also find little like doorways into understanding each other even a little bit differently or in a new way that I think is kind of incredible. I had an experience like probably, I don't know, a week or two after the stay-at-home orders started in Denver, where I called up a friend because it was April 1st, it was her birthday. And this is a friend I almost never talk to. I mean, we talk maybe once or twice a year. And I had the experience of calling her up and thinking, I wonder what she's up to. And then realizing, I know what she's up to because it's what we're all up to. She's at home. She's, you know, going to be having a party for her birthday. She's not going to be, you know, going out on the town. She's at home. That's what she's doing. And it was sort of this like, oh, like, no, we're all going through this. Every one of us, and you know, there are, as you said, these categories. There are some who are much more impacted in really frightening ways, and others who are more impacted in an annoying way of like, I want to be able to go out and I can't go out. And yet, even that moment of calling her up and thinking, oh, we're both, yeah, I know what she's doing because we're both doing the same thing, was pretty amazing to me.
It's true.
The first time, and maybe one of the only times in my life that I'll be having an experience like that, where I just kind of can know you know, that we're in it together in that way.
I know, that is really remarkable. Yeah, everybody is just kind of there at home, and you know, and if you make some guesses, you're often right. You say, have you been baking bread? You know, have you been starting a vegetable garden? Have you been weaving? Have you been starting a new craft? Hey, did you take up an old musical instrument? It's like, I mean, are you sticking with an exercise regime, but actually you can't? I mean, it's like, did you get out your treadmill, but you can't get yourself to get on it? It's like so many people I've talked to that this is where, and there I was interviewed today as part of a doctoral student who's doing her dissertation on what do DBT teams do when there's been somebody who committed suicide within their team. I mean, within a client in their team. And so she's trying to come up, and it turns out there's very little written about that in DBT. There's a ton on what do you do before suicide and to prevent suicide and protocols to manage the risk and everything, but there's very little, like a paragraph here and there. So she's doing a very valuable project. And then, so her project is to interview people who've been in those situations. And so I was one of those people. And so we had like an hour interview, just wide-ranging discussion. And she said at the end, she said, I am so grateful for the pandemic from this one point of view, is that everybody I have asked to interview is just sitting at home, you know, and it's sort of like, I've been able, like everyone in the field that I ask says, yeah, I'll do it. It's like that never happens. And it's really true. So there are these moments that this works because we're all doing something like the same thing. And I've had a couple patients that are very lonely that had an interesting reaction to this, where they said from early on, this one woman that I treat who's very alone, and her mood problem has made it impossible to get out there. Now she can't go out there in places that she thought she should go out there but couldn't get herself to go out there. And she feels better because she feels like everybody's stuck at home. So she's actually not as alone anymore. She's joined the world, or the world has joined her by everybody staying at home and not going out and socializing. And so she feels like, yeah, okay, I'm now closer to people. It's interesting, you know, really so different for different people. Yeah. Now I find from a DBT principle-based perspective that I think we've been in a way talking, and the way you put everything, a lot about willingness, the principle of willingness, the skill of willingness, of leaning into and accepting the cards that you've been dealt in the moment, not the cards you wish you were dealt, not the cards that you weren't dealt, but actually the cards you were dealt, and then looking at them and saying, okay, so I'm home. Okay, my children still need to get an education. Okay, I still need to do some of my work. Okay, I'm now more responsible for taking care of everything in my house. And I'm going back and forth between work and home in the same room. And it's like, you know, okay, to toss away the attachment to things shouldn't be this way is a very helpful thing that one can do for moments, and then maybe over time and more. I don't know, it just requires, it's like that in DBT, like that concept of willing hands. It's like, okay, all right, I'll go with that. Okay, I guess that's the way it is. I'll go with it, and I'll actually go with it willingly, that this is the nature of reality now, and it wasn't yesterday. And making that switch is so hard, but it can happen. And the more you can lean into it, the more you think, okay, yep. A week ago, I was doing this with my life. Now I'm doing about 5,000 different things. I have a different sleep cycle, a different nutritional status, a different exercise cycle, different relationships, different children, different spouse, different dogs and cats. It's like incredible. But if you can do that, it's like landing on another planet every day and adjusting to that planet. And so I think it's willingness.
I think you're right. You know, Charlie, it's funny that you say it, because I was thinking, I had a whole conversation about willingness with someone this morning, and the difference, we were kind of talking about willingness versus opposite action, or you know, because in some ways I was thinking of them as one and the same. So for those that are familiar with opposite action, the skill in DBT is, you know, to act opposite to an emotional urge, to change the emotion. And as you're talking, Charlie, I'm sitting here like nodding along and thinking, who is a better example in my life right now of willingness than my sister? Like I mean, her career, you know, based entirely on travel is just, who knows when it's going to come back around. And then she's come here to help us, right? She's like moved in, she's taking care of our kids, helping with, I mean, she's really doing like the lion's share of homeschool, because I'm still working, my husband's working, but we're both working from home. And I feel like, as you say, willingness is it's not just doing what's needed. I mean, it's doing what's needed, but it is doing it with a particular posture and a particular, I think like a relaxed stance or a fluidness that allows one to actually really be all in a unique way. And it's funny because when this all first happened, I was kind of, I think I told her, I don't know if I told her, but she's listening, so maybe she'll hear it now, that, you know, I felt like, I was like, I don't think you know the skill of opposite action, but that's what you're doing. It's like you're just kind of throwing yourself all in 100%, even though it's, you know, it's heartbreaking that you can't go to work, but, you know, you're here and you're doing, you know, you're doing life here with us. And it seemed, you know, I think it was a good thing for both of us. Yeah. Like, you know, now it's like, is the opposite action, is it willingness? Or I think it's both. I mean, it's that particular stance of sort of letting go of attachment to what you imagined, what you know, the ideas that you had about what life was or would be, or how you would go, and then seeing what the path actually is. And not just seeing what it is and walking it, but walking it as if it's, you know, where you were meant to walk, in a way that you're embracing it as it is your path. You know, it's sort of a different stance.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through from the point of view of opposite action, which actually in the last podcast I talked about a certain amount. To me, what it would be is the opposite action to the emotion of resentment, or something like that. Like you could imagine resenting what's going on, and resenting what you have to do, and resenting that your livelihood is being altered and maybe changed for a long time. And then so you can be bitter about that. But it's like acting opposite bitterness by saying, you know what, I'll move into my sister's house and I'll look after her children in homeschooling, and I'll lean into it. And now that's my new job. You know, and that's what I'll do. And there's something about that that's unbelievably generous. And however she made that pivot, but it really is making a pivot into the wind, and then saying, okay, if that's the way things are going, I'm going there, you know. And that's the metaphor of surfing in life, which is an unfortunate metaphor for me, because the only time I tried, I could never stand up for more than about 1 second. And I remember doing this on the coast, and my 2 boys just getting up and surfing along, and their dad getting up and falling down a million times. And, you know, I'm a relentless trier, but I couldn't do it. But the metaphor of surfing, which means I don't have to do it, but as a metaphor, it really works, because it's like you can't dictate the next wave. And if you try to surf the way you did the last wave, it's not going to work for the next wave, especially if it's an unusual wave like this pandemic. This pandemic is like a once in a century wave. And all of us know that from one particular angle, but it's unbelievable when you add up the billions of people and how everyone is having to surf a new wave. And that people in countries across the globe are doing stuff that we're doing. So not only when you say this, does it happen to be that I'm at home while you're home, and so are other people you know, but there's also people in northern Italy who are home while you're home, people that I've known when I've been training and I've been in contact with, like they're home too. And they're not visiting their parents either, because they don't want to infect their parents. And they're bringing food to the doorstep of their parents and then stepping back to the street and texting them and saying, there is food on the porch now. And that's happening in India, and it's happening in Greece. It's like, there's something about this that as awful as some aspects of this are, there's been a unifying theme. So people are sharing a certain number of common experiences in different cultures and in different ways and with different levels of resources. And that's the other thing I wanted to say. Another sort of, there's nothing new under the sun about this. Well, one thing I realized is actually all of this, what's happening with the pandemic, the kind of things we're talking about, are things that are absolutely common to daily life. They just don't usually don't have this magnitude. But things are different. You know, when I say to people, how are you? And they say, oh, same old, same old. I know that's not true. I hear that and I know it's not true. What I say to different people depends on the person, but it's never true. But this is now really not same old, same old. Oh, just another pandemic. No, sorry, that's not really what's going on. So that's one thing. But this other thing that is always true, and now it's magnified. It's always true, but now it's in the spotlight, is the level of inequality between people within our society is stunning and awful and makes me almost want to cry even as I say it. Because, and this puts a glaring light. There are the people like me who actually, even though I'm hamstrung in some ways in my work and in my personal life and where I'm going and can't travel and all this stuff, in a way, big deal by comparison to the person who lives in a single apartment and who now can't afford food and who now can't walk out of their apartment without being in another enclosed space with other people who might have the virus. It's like, oh my God. Or the people like I have a close friend in Vermont who just adopted or took over the foster care of 2 7-year-old girls and just started that like first week of March. And then boom, there they are. I mean, she's homeschooling them and living with them 24 hours a day and she's a biologist in the state of Vermont, studies bats. Actually, she's a researcher on bats and presents internationally on bats. And, you know, she knows all about this virus stuff, but it's like, oh my God, such changes. And she has some more resources than some, but you know, the vast majority of people are not in that 1% or even 5% or even 30%, or by definition, they're not in the top 49%. I mean, and if you're below the top 49%, you know, this is hitting you in a very different way. And it's just disturbing. You know, it's just disturbing. And just to know it and to feel impotent about it, even if you're making some inroads or you're doing something personally, there's still the economic structuring of our country and our economy is so disturbing to me. I mean, this brings, usually I don't get political in these podcasts, not for any other reason other than usually I'm thinking about other things, but I'm just bullshit about what decisions have been made in the last 30 or 40 years that have led up to this moment. And now this really is going to kill people as a result of that. The inequity is terrible. So, and the management of this has been so terrible that then I get really angry and have to regulate those emotions, as some of my patients do. If they even watch television for 1 minute, they might end up in a hospital. Literally, I have 2 people like that. And I won't end up in a hospital, but my next 5 conversations might not be very pleasant. I might not be very pleasant about it. So, you know, the pandemic is affecting that because it shines a spotlight on inequities. You know, it's like when the flood comes and all the people go under who don't have resources. So that's disturbing to me, and it certainly not a profound insight. In fact, let me just say that nothing I said in this is a profound insight. So it's not like I'm distinguishing it from anything else I said, because ever since I've truly taken in this notion that everything I say is actually in some ways just recycling. It's repackaging of things that have been going on and being said for a long time, but in my own style. But even my style is adopted from other people's styles. So, you know, but still, I think I'm still appreciate being able to talk with you about this.
If I may add something, I think Cedar Coons did a blog post a while back about being vigilant in the darkness. And she was talking about, you know, essentially this, like kind of the way that the pandemic has brought more to light things that have been there all along, these inequalities and such. And her point was really to pay attention to what's happening as far as like elections and your voting capacities and things like that. And I think for me, I've been thinking a lot back to this concept of impermanence. Like, it's not just the attachment to what was and, you know, thinking, you know, I want to keep what was, or my mind going back to the past, but also this awareness that our ideas about the future, often it's in the form of like taking for granted what we think will come about, or taking for granted our the sort of routines, or there's a different word I'm looking for, but the practices that we just assume will happen and that will potentially, you know, help make things better, or potentially, you know, bring about change or things like that. But we have to really pay attention, because we don't know how, you know, all of this is going to keep affecting, you know, our society or those that, you know, make decisions. And we really have to pay attention. And I think there's something really good about change when it has the effect of helping us pay more attention and bringing us, sort of awakening us to those things. And I mean, I think it's been happening over time, but for sure, there's an acuteness to it right now where people are much more alert, or hopefully, I think they are.
Yeah. I think people are alert to very different things right now, but there is a heightened sense of awareness of things. I mean, it does remind me of this being aware and alert. I mean, there was a meta-analysis in Chicago many years ago, looking at which neighborhoods in the Chicago area are subject to the most violence, and they they categorized lots of neighborhoods, characterized them, then went around and studied these different neighborhoods to look at what are the characteristics. And you would think, well, socioeconomics will be an important factor. It's one factor, but it wasn't the single most important factor that predicted which neighborhoods would have more violence. You know, the neighborhoods that had less violence, more than anything else, tended to be neighborhoods in which people knew each other's children. Like, you know, the children of the people down the block. And therefore, there's almost like a camaraderie among parents, and an awareness among parents of what else is going on in the neighborhood and what are the other kids doing. And it gave a certain way, different parents would have, therefore, a sort of more of a sense of accountability, responsibility, and authority when it came to somebody else's 11-year-old that's hanging out doing something not very helpful. So I thought that was really interesting, because I just assumed other factors would be overwhelmingly the factors, but that's a big factor, and it's affected me ever since I learned that little piece of research. It's affected me in just thinking how, you know, the people down the block, in my case, from where I live and where I work in Northampton. It's like, okay, it's good for me to know who works at CVS drugstore. It's good for me to know who's at Brugger's Bagels, where I get my coffee, you know, and it's good for me to know what's going on at that Chinese restaurant in the other direction and the pizza guy down the road. And there's this sense of security and an awareness that comes from, oh, you go in somewhere and you notice that somebody's missing, you know, and you ask about them. It's just that little moment. It's just one ripple effect. That if you ask about that, people then think, oh, Charlie knows who was in here and noticed, and which no one ever comments. So it's more difficult in my solo private practice. No one ever comes in from these organizations and says, hey, doc, can I have a session? You know, but sometimes I think about putting just a little table out on the sidewalk and say, you know, psychiatric consultation, 5 cents.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and then and literally do some consultations to some homeless people, which happen to be in front of my office. But, you know, so, and what impact that would make. So I like what you say about this, because there is a kind of the more you pay attention, I think, to what is happening in these realms about the waves that are coming, and realize that actually, much as you may think you can make a small input in it, that willingness would be to say, yeah, write a letter to the editor, vote, get other people to vote, talk with people about it. Actually, all of these little things that people like Obama say, that's what you should do with your feelings and thoughts about, and think, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that goes along with these sort of principles of impermanence and interdependency and dialectics, where you're really sort of like going ahead and playing a role, even if it provokes opposition, or it's in an oppositional environment, that you are putting yourself in that, knowing that there'll be backlash, and things like that. Sort of like, jump in. You get one chance to live, as far as we know. So, who knows? Most cultures in history have not thought that, so who knows what's the truth. But our little culture is convinced that you have one chance to live. So I'll go with that at the moment. Seems like the safest bet.
At least one that you're aware of. So
yeah, at least you're aware of that, aware of this present moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Reminds me, I don't know, Kathryn, if you ever listened to the podcast I did where I told the story about my friend Cindy, that in the first podcast I said this was a tribute to her from the beginning, 3 years ago. And, I still go back, even though she's dead from Earth, I still go back and have conversations with her. And it's been 17 years. And I've talked with her about the pandemic. Because when you ask somebody who's dead, what do you think of the pandemic? They have a very different perspective than we have on the pandemic. After death is a very different time to think about things than before death. It's like death looks different to you. First of all, it looks inevitable. And it looks like your point of view about death is, of course, right. Oh, and you died 10 years earlier than you should have? Of course. I mean, she died a lot of years before she should have. And, so there's kind of like communicating with a dead person really helps you increase acceptance of things, because when you get that, tell them, I'm really upset about what happened. They just listen. Say, yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, that's bad, isn't it? Well, all things pass. It's like, and they know that in a way. So, I've already prepared to talk to dead people when I'm dead, but I'm already talking to dead people when I'm alive, because it actually helps increase wisdom, I think, when you talk to a dead person, even if it's a person that you imagine you're talking to. The part of you that can identify with dead people gives you answers. I highly recommend it, as a therapy. Yeah, sit and add a third chair to the session and talk to your dead self, 20 years forward or something. Helps you get into the present moment. Hey, look, gosh, and it's my favorite radio people, Click and Clack, the car talk guys, ended every show with, well, now you've killed another perfectly good hour of your life listening to us. And so I guess that's what's happened again. Anyone who did last to the end of this, I really appreciate talking to you. Look forward to doing it again. It's just like we sort of have this ability to go back and forth that I really appreciate, building on each other's thoughts. I like that.
I agree. Yeah, I feel the same.
And you brought relatives along too. You brought a whole bleacher section, your sister, you said, and anyone else from your family. So.
Yeah, my husband's on as well. It's all good. Oh, there she is.
Oh, there she is. Yeah,
she was there for a second.
And like I said, my wife hears enough from me in the house, so I don't think she would add to that by the end of the podcast, but you never know. You can be in another room and listen to the podcast and not know it.
Can I say one more thing as we end here? Thinking about one of the things that's been highlighted for me here for sure in this whole experience is this dichotomy, or I guess I don't know if it's quite the right word, but on one hand, like becoming super aware of my interactions with other people and keeping my distance. And then also how important my relationships are and how important connection and human connection is. And it's so funny because I've always, I've done a lot of different work online over the years. I mean, for the past 5 or 6 years, a large part of my work week is online. And so I'm used to the, seeing people through the screen and saying hi and saying goodbye. And yeah, I always have this little urge, like I just want to give everybody a hug and all of the goodbyes that are a little bit more physical and close, and it's always a little bittersweet. But thank you for having me, Charlie. I really appreciate the opportunity to converse with you in person, because I converse with you in my head all the time. But
isn't it funny how we now have redefined what it means to be in person? Yeah,
yes.
So
that is true.
Hug.
Yes, hug. You well all.
So everybody who's listening now or in the future or from the past, we'll say goodbye. And I do not anticipate doing a podcast next week, because I'll be immersed, as I said, in those workshops that I'm doing online during next week, and I'm going to be exhausted when you start them at 5 in the morning because of the time difference. It's just, I'm going to have to sleep in the afternoons. So bye, Kathryn. Thank you.
Bye, Charlie. Thank you. Bye, all.
Bye, all.